Merci beaucoup, and thanks very much, Natalie, for the invite. It's great to have an interdisciplinary group here today, and what I would so really there's two things in line today. The first is that myself, along with Bruce Mitchell at the University of Waterloo, Dan Walters at Nipissing University, and Barbara Veal at Halton Conservation, we put together a special issue in the International Journal of Water Resources Development looking at this topic. And so part of the talk will be about some of the key findings as a result of that research, and I'll talk a little bit more about what exactly we did. What I'll focus most of my comments on today is looking at two case studies, one in Quebec and the other in the Annapolis Valley, to try to understand a little bit in greater detail what is going on with the actual agencies themselves with respect to planning and management and financing. And what I've found in this preliminary analysis so far is that the findings from those two, which are very different, as you'll see, are supportive of the conclusions of the whole article. So, integrated water resources management. This is the definition from the Global Water Partnership that is often touted as the best definition. And for me, there's really 5 important considerations in thinking about integrated water resource management. And some of these are not in this definition. But the first is that we should think about the watershed as the administrative unit rather than political boundaries. The second is that because we've got a catchment, it's much easier to think about upstream and downstream water users, of groundwater and surface water, of water quality, of water quantity. And so thinking about, integrated, those are 3 dimensions of integration that with the catchment, very easy to think about these things. The other is that we shouldn't be thinking just about water itself. We should be thinking about the related land resources, such as wetlands and aquifers. That we should be looking at water in terms of supporting our environment and our lives, our economies, and providing us with aesthetic beauty to rejuvenate the spirit. And finally, that it's a stakeholder approach. So those would be some components that are fundamental to me that are underlaying this definition by the Global Water Partnership. So what we did then was that we looked at a conference, the proceedings of a conference from 1981 called Comprehensive River Basin Management Canadian Experiences. It was held at the University of Waterloo, and they brought water managers from all over the country and academics to really have an assessment of what the state of water planning was at the time. And these are the 5 key findings in terms of what were the challenges facing water management at the time. And so the first is that there's no single correct approach. So there's no golden bullet to solve all our water problems. It will depend on the variety of physical geographies and human geographies across the country. Having said that, there's lots of wrong ways to do it, but there's no single right way to do it. Now, what they were finding in the late 70s and early 80s was that it took a tremendous amount of time to write one plan. Sometimes 2, 3, or 4 years. And then the implementation would take place after the plan. And so it was thought that's far too long to be waiting for a solution. The second thing was that part of the reason that it took time was public participation. And again, it was relatively new. And oftentimes it was done through public meetings and information sessions at malls and open houses and the like. And that was taking a lot of time, and it really wasn't that effective, that the managers who were wanting the input were not hearing what they wanted to hear in terms of what's good, bad, and indifferent about our thinking. And the public was saying, well, we're not quite being listened to. And so it was really frustrating for both managers and the publics at that time. There was really a breakdown in communication, or poor communication, between the planners who were writing the plans and then the decision makers who would have to decide which components of the plan would be implemented when. And examples of this would be that there would be tens or hundreds of recommendations without any priority set to what should be done first versus second versus third. And oftentimes, it was quite clear that the problem might lie, for instance, in inadequate sewage treatment. And so rather than having a study or a plan focused on that problem, they brought in a lot of other things and again contributed to the time. And so this is in the realm of the need to improve the communication between planners and decision makers. And at that time, the focus was on water itself. And in my opening comments about what we think about in terms of contemporary integrated water resource management, it's appropriate that we think about the related land-based issues. And so what we did then is that in 2014, there was a meeting of the Canadian Water Resources Association, and we thought, well, why don't we get, and it was in Ontario, and my own research has often focused on the Ontario Conservation Authority program. And so we thought, well, let's have some managers from the Ontario Conservation Authority's program talk to us about the state of that initiative. And during the presentation, we thought, well, what if we expanded it? And we wrote a book, or at least articles, similar to this exercise. Now, this one had hundreds. When we approached a journal, again, the International Journal of Water Resources Development, they said you can have 9. And so I want you to understand that what I'll be presenting today is illustrative of what's going on in Canada. It is absolutely not representative, and I'm not sure if you can, in a single case study or a group of case studies, in the absence of doing the entire country, come up with, well, what is representative? And so they're very much illustrative examples. But here's what we got. So again, there's a concentration in Ontario because that's where it started with the Ontario Conservation Authority program. But we have watershed-based organizations, and again, in thinking about integrated water management and the importance of having a water catchment as the administrative unit, this is what we wanted to focus on. So we did not approach ministries of the environment and climate change or natural resources or local governments. We wanted watershed-based organizations because we thought that they are the people with respect to have the affinity to the watershed as the administrative unit. So Okanagan, Bow River in Alberta, the Manitoba Conservation Districts, we've got 2 conservation authorities. In Quebec, the St. John River Watershed, the Annapolis River Watershed in Nova Scotia, and then an initiative in St. John. So there's reasonable coverage of across the nation of what's happening with watershed-based organizations. I'll get this right. All right, and so as I said, I will be focusing some of my comments on the experiences in Quebec, and so not specifically with the St. John watershed, and then the Annapolis River watershed. And so There are 40 water organizations, they're called in Quebec, and perhaps you're familiar with them. And so, as we'll find out, they're established under statute. The Annapolis River watershed, it's a unique example. It's the only one of its kind in the province of Nova Scotia. It has about 2,200 square kilometers in size. It enters the Gulf of Maine. It's primarily an agricultural dominated economy, and not surprisingly, diffuse source pollution is a major concern, but there are some smaller urban areas that have inadequate sewage treatment and urban runoff and concerns for fisheries. And in Quebec, the 40 have a range of issues confronting them. So just want to talk a little bit about how each of these organizations was formed, because kind of the understanding the history and the differences in the history and the similarities helps us understand the state of integrated watershed management in the country. So in terms of Quebec then, in 1968, the Legendre Commission considered questions in terms of access to water in general. It was thought at the time far too much private ownership and access to water, and in Quebec there's particularly a strong sense that the public, the government, should have a strong sense of play there. So they conducted a study, and at the end of it, really this started a trend that separated water from land management. So the Legendre Commission was focused really on water itself. And what the follow-up Beauchamp Commission said in 2002, so quite a time after the Legendre Commission, the next significant event was the Beauchamp Commission, and it really said three things. It said, first, we should adopt a water policy in the province. You didn't have one before. And so every agency kind of did its own thing. And that would be common not only throughout the rest of Canada, but certainly the world. And many spots in the world continue to manage water in the absence of an overriding policy. That you should adopt new water laws, both for withdrawal and water quality protection, and that you should establish a royalty system. And so this is where industries in particular would be charged for the use of the water. So the start of an economic instrument to manage water. In 2002 then, following immediately after the Beauchamp Commission, then the Quebec government adopted a water policy. And it established priorities, central to it was a sense that integrated water resource management should be at the heart of that policy. And has established priorities for revising laws, for making evidence-based decision-making on good science, both physical science as well as social science, because really watershed issues are a combination of the two, where humans and the water ecosystem come together. So there's a need to have knowledge on both fronts, that you should adopt economic instruments. And so for 2002, this is a pretty forward-looking and bold step for Quebec to be making in terms of its policy, and that it should be based on partnerships among government, non-government, private, and the citizens within. And again, that's a very strong tradition within Quebec. So those were the priorities, and it allowed for the formation of what you call watershed or water organizations. And it's I'll have more to say about how IWRM is implemented. And then the Quebec Water Act, which was passed in 2009, it allows the minister to actually recognize a water organization and fund it, or deny a group. So not just anyone can become a watershed organization. So this is very much a top-down approach, relatively. Again, lots of discussions. This was not imposed. I'm not saying that. But the Quebec government is taking a lead role in saying we recognize the importance of water. We have issues with our water resources. We need to fix it. And so this was the key elements of the solutions since the late 60s. It's a very different situation in Atlantic Canada, where water management was and remains highly fragmented relative to Quebec. All right, and so the province then, which I start there because provinces own the resources. All right, and so the provinces, and not the federal government, and not local governments, which are formed at the will of the provincial governments, they play the key role in the management of water resources within their jurisdiction. And so they developed in 2002, so relatively recent history relative compared to Quebec, a drinking water strategy. And it just really said that we need to move beyond just worrying about drinking water. The second, in 2007, was the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act in 2007. And it's made the statement that we need a more economically and environmentally sustainable province by 2020. So it's almost there. And that they outlined the goals of developing a water strategy. And that was developed 3 years later in 2010 with a Water for Life strategy. And it really just identified goals of somewhat similar to the Quebec water policy of developing, gathering and sharing information and resources among those who use and manage water. They wanted to renew policies within an integrated water resource management framework. And they wanted to establish a means of implementing integrated water resource management. So there's no formal commitment to a watershed-based organization within the province of Nova Scotia. What did happen in 1985 was that the Annapolis Valley Affiliated Boards of Trade, which was comprised of local businesses, cultural groups, and government agencies, they started, it was a group that became concerned with water quality in the Annapolis Valley. And then at about the same time, the federal government, under the the federal government adopted the Heritage River System. And it was thought that the Annapolis River Valley would be a candidate for that program. And so the initial focus then was to develop a plan or submission based on the natural and cultural resources within the watershed for it to go forward to the federal government and to be adjudicated. That submission was made, but it was not successful. Now in 1990 then, the Clean Annapolis River Project was formed. And here academics from the area, along with government agencies and industry, and particularly the agricultural industry, became concerned with water quality. And at the same time, the government, under the Green Plan, adopted the Atlantic Coast Action Plan, which provided money for environmental projects. And so the government, the provincial government, approached CARP to say, would you like to apply for ACAP money, which is federal money. And so the fit was made. So you had money from the federal government coming to this locally based organization. They were a nonprofit organization. And by 2009, the ACAP had transformed into the Federal Atlantic Ecosystem Initiative. And this caused carp some problems because ACAP was focused on very much regional entities. And so a 2,000 square kilometer watershed is very much a regional entity. The scale changed with the Atlantic Ecosystem Initiative, where they wanted projects that benefit a much larger area. So a bigger bang. I'm not sure if it's a bigger bang for the buck, bigger bang for bigger bucks. But what it did is that under ACAP, the carp was able to reasonably, easily access money for its activities. And it became more difficult after 2009. But the federal government importance here is highly significant for integrated water resource management. And the three key initiatives then, again, were to share water resources information among the users, renew policies to enhance the capacity for IWRM, and establish a working group. Okay, so the structure and the purpose. So as I mentioned earlier, the Quebec water organizations, there are 40, located largely in the populated areas along the St. Lawrence, the Ottawa, and the Saguenay River valleys. They are independent and autonomous and recognized by the Quebec government. And fairly large, in that on average, they'll have about 60 members. So again, community members and users and NGOs. And then they'll have an elected board that will make the decisions. And they'll have a staff of 1 or 2, as you'll see. But the purpose then is quite limited. First of all, they are to develop or create a water master plan. And then they are to facilitate and monitor implementation. But they are not empowered to implement itself. So CARP, again, it's unique, one of a kind in the province. It's a registered nonprofit charity. It has a 15-member volunteer board, so quite a bit smaller than the water organizations, and they elect an executive board. And its purpose is to enhance the ecological health of the watershed through science, leadership, and community engagement. Again, similar to the water organizations in Quebec, that verb of implement is missing. But planning is an important feature of both of these organizations. So how do they plan and operate? So in Quebec, the government now has established guidelines for what a plan should look like. So there have been 2 rounds of planning. The first round, there weren't any guidelines. And my sense is that some were great plans and some further work needed to be done, I think is what a professor would say or a student would read. The minister, right, so once the plan is submitted, will review it, and if it's acceptable, he or she will approve the plan and then circulate it to the departments within the Quebec government that are relevant. I think there's about 27. And then to the local governments within the watershed. And it's hoped that they will implement the plan. Now, implementation is sometimes facilitated because in the planning process, the water organizations will actually have provincial officials and municipal officials on the board drafting the plan. And so you can get buy-in from those people who, at the end of the day, will likely be responsible for implementation. Now, the financing is that the Quebec government provides $123,500 per water organization. So when you multiply that by 40, that's about a $5 million commitment that the Quebec government is making to the water organizations. Another way of looking at it is that's about 63 cents per head per resident of Quebec. Now they can also, because they're an autonomous organization, they can apply for funds. And there's been two primary funds that they have reached out to. The first is the Quebec Green Premium Plan, which is focused on agricultural activities, so very similar to those in the Annapolis Valley. And then the second is again federal funds through the Partnership for Recreational Fisheries Conservation Program. And so fisheries, part of it is ecosystem, but part of it is economy. And so we'll be thinking about society, environment, economy in terms of sustainable development and integration. And the water organizations, may receive the funds or may not. There's no entitlement to the money, but they would certainly be seen as credible in that they've got a plan. That plan's been approved by the minister, and the minister has recognized the watershed organization officially. Now CARP, all right, they've had 4 plans between 1996 and 2012 with absolutely no guidelines, right? So they will engage their stakeholders and the community members, and then they will write a plan that is seen as desirable and feasible to that group. And so heavy engagement using the best science and information that is available. And again, that's promoted under the Nova Scotia Water strategy. But there is a very heavy reliance on stakeholder engagement. That acceptability is really the key criterion to make the plan acceptable. Where I think in Quebec, the stakeholder endorsement would be one of the priorities, but not the predominant priority. That economic efficiency and effectiveness and these other things would be in the mix. Now the finance, this is interesting, given that the water organizations are officially recognized by the Quebec government, and CARP is a one-off, is that much larger budgets between $550,000 and $650,000. And why? Because they've got the private sector sitting with them, right, developing the plans. And oftentimes the agricultural community will contribute funds to support the program. And also a lot of information education. And you can see the division over the last 5 years, the average. So again, this is post ACAP and under this new initiative. And so they seem to be doing relatively well. So the federal government and the province are in for about 60%. Corporations and NGOs for 42%, and then donations for 1%. And so much larger budget, but it's not a certain budget. They have to, what they'll do is identify projects to their potential funders that the funders will either accept or reject. Right? So a very pragmatic approach to the funding. But again, implementation, those are paltry funds, levels of funds when you're thinking about a 2,000 square kilometer watershed. So just thinking then about some of the areas of progress and the trends since that 1981 conference. The first is that I think there's some clarification what the concept of integrated water resource management means in practice. And I think it means 3 things. The first is this mixing of environment, economy, and society. And we can see it with the emphasis in part on fisheries, with the boards of trade, which is an economically based organization in the Annapolis Valley. They were concerned that an unhealthy environment would lead to an unhealthy economy. Probably we're very interested in that link between environment and economy, and what we may want to attend to is, in the future, the social aspects a bit more. The second thing that I think the concept of integrated water resource management means in practice is that in both those examples, they're wanting information on both the human and the natural processes and quality, quantity, fisheries, groundwater, surface water. So that's the second element in practice that we're seeing integrated water resource management focus on in Canada and the 2 case studies. And the third thing is to really get the provincial agencies and local agencies, and where appropriate the federal government, to coordinate their activities. And so this administrative integration is important to the practice of integrated water resource management. The next thing is that, very similar to the 1981 conference, there remains no single magic bullet, not a magic wand to say this is the best. All right, they're both, I would say, relatively successful. Could they do better? And I'll have some comments about this. Absolutely. But they are not disasters. Absolutely not. They have a high degree of credibility among both the scientific, the political, and the public forum. Now, relative to 1981, there's a more appropriate planning process in that, as I was mentioning earlier, sometimes it was taking years for studies to be done. And what was being done in the 1970s and 80s is what I would call a comprehensive approach, where you gather all the information that you can, whether it's relevant or not to your study, but you will describe in great detail the resource inventory of the watershed. And that's important research, but in a practical sense, it's at the time not appropriate for informing decision making. And so they spent far too much time gathering information that wasn't relevant. I'm not saying the information isn't good, but it's research that's not addressed to the program. What's being done now is what I would call an integrated approach, where you say, what are the key issues in front of us? What's the information that we have and that we need in the future, and perhaps we should be expanding the monitoring network? And then let's write the plan. And we can see that with the CARP having to write 4 plans since 1996. So what's happened is that it's taking shorter to write 1 plan, but you're always planning. And so what I would really like to do moving ahead is to see what the difference is in the evolution of the 2 sets of plans that have been submitted by similar watershed organizations in Quebec, and then the 4 plans. I mean, are they radically different, or are they relatively directional and one building on the other? And I do not know the question to that, but I will say that it's the single process is more appropriate. I'm not sure whether planning all the time is a good thing or not, and I'll have to give that some more other thought, and perhaps you'll have some questions based on your. Now, there's relatively more emphasis on implementation and monitoring with lots of planning, but it's still not in the hands of the watershed-based organizations. That it's with the provincial government agencies and with local government agencies where the accountability and the ability to raise funds is far greater. And I'm not sure that that's going to change in the future. And so if we're thinking about improving our ability to implement integrated water resource management plans, we've got to work around that constraint and look for the opportunities. Public engagement remains crucial, and I think it's better practiced that we can see that members of the public are actually on these boards, both executive and having 60 members on average for the water organizations. allows the public either direct or indirect influence over setting the agenda. So there's a bit of power sharing there. There's a variety of financial arrangements that are available to the watershed agencies. And really they have to be opportunistic about how they avail themselves to certainly monies available from senior government, whether it's federal or provincial, and corporate and private funds as well. But when the rules change very quickly, such as when the federal government went from the Atlantic Coastal Action Plan to the more larger scale ecosystem initiative, that can put an organization like CARP very vulnerable. And they were successful in responding to that. And there's a sharing of resources and responsibility among the partners. Now, some of the current challenges then is that there are ongoing threats to water. And my sense is that in the late 70s and early 80s, we thought of water issues as really local issues. Certainly, they're much more regional, if not global, in nature. And so the scale has increased. And I think at the time, primarily thought that, well, with water pollution, it'll be the environment that is polluted. Well, what we now know is that human health is at risk. And so those would be some of the new ongoing threats that we have. We can see in both those examples and in the other case studies that the capacity to meet the needs and the challenges is ubiquitous in both. There's very limited capacity within the watershed-based organizations themselves to undertake much of anything. And that implementation is difficult in the absence of legal authority, which would provide you with funding. And so in thinking about the next steps and how to better implement things, I think that Quebec might be a model for other provinces to think about. And the components of that are that you have these water master plans being developed that appear to be relatively acceptable among the watershed residents and organizations and users, and that are likely feasible. And so given that, I'm not sure it's desirable. I also don't think it's feasible to all of a sudden increase the capacity of the watershed organizations and give them tens of millions of dollars to implement the various projects. But what I would encourage the Quebec government to think about is to pool the money that the 27 provincial agencies, which have some responsibility for water, and the local governments, and then set like regional priorities to say, well, for instance, the St. John River is where our priority is next year, and we're going to give them a lot of money in order to implement these 2 or 3 aspects of their plan. And again, you could kind of pick the other parts of Quebec that would move in a more systematic way, and I think a more significant way, into implementing the plans. Because if planning becomes the process, all right, and is the end goal, is the product, pardon me, if planning becomes the product of integrated water resource management, well, we're not going to go anywhere. It's going to be on memory sticks, or if you print it out, it's going to collect dust on bookshelves, and those are no good. So we really need to focus on the implementation much more systematically. Again, I think Quebec can lead the way with us, because if you take the economic instrument steps further and spend more of the revenue that is generated by water on water projects, right, versus other things. Again, that's a political decision. So, but that when you tax or you set a fee to individuals, they become much more responsible in their use. And if the proceeds from the water resources are being reinvested in your water resources, it seems to me that a more sustainable water future and social future and economic future lies ahead for residents in Quebec, in Nova Scotia, and across the country. So thanks very much.